The private audience chamber in St. James's Palace had witnessed centuries of history, but on this particular Tuesday afternoon, the air hummed with a tension that had nothing to do with affairs of state. Queen Camilla stood by the tall windows overlooking the mall, her posture immaculate in a tailored cream suit, a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. She was waiting for the arrival of the new regimental colonel, a formality that would take perhaps 15 minutes, a quick handshake, some polite conversation about the regiment's history, and the obligatory photograph. Outside the heavy oak doors, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington of the Coldstream Guards adjusted his ceremonial tunic for the third time. At 42, he was a soldier's soldier, decorated for service in Afghanistan, more comfortable in combat fatigues than the ornate red and gold uniform now required of him. His bearskin hat sat under his arm, and he ran through the protocol in his head. Enter when announced, bow from the neck only, address Her Majesty as ma'am pronounced to rhyme with ham, accept the royal handshake, do not initiate conversation about anything controversial. The doors swung open. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, Coldstream Guards, the equerry announced. Harrington stepped forward, his eyes briefly adjusting to the relative dimness after the bright corridor, and he saw the Queen Consort silhouetted against the window, turned slightly away as she placed her teacup on a side table. She was perhaps 5'6", elegant, silver-haired, and completely unaware of his precise location. Protocol demanded precision. Guardsmen were trained to move with purpose, to navigate spaces with military efficiency. But the chamber's layout had been rearranged since his last briefing. A small, occasional table had been positioned where his memory placed open floor. Harrington took 3 measured steps, then saw the obstacle too late. His left hip caught the table's corner. A porcelain figurine wobbled dangerously. Harrington's trained reflexes kicked in. He reached to steady it, but in doing so, his body angled sharply to the right. His ceremonial pace quickened involuntarily as he tried to correct his trajectory. Camilla turned at the sound of scraping furniture. She saw a tall figure in red approaching rapidly, his face flushed, his trajectory erratic. And in that split second, her mind processed what her eyes saw. A man in uniform moving toward her with unexpected speed, his right hand reaching for what? To steady himself? To grab her? The attempted kidnapping of Princess Anne in 1974 was part of royal family lore. Every senior royal knew the stories. "Guardsmen!" she heard herself say, her voice sharper than intended. But Harrington was committed now, off balance and unable to stop. His outstretched hand, he meant to brace against the wall behind her, instead made contact with her upper arm. It wasn't a push, it was more of an awkward brush, the kind of accidental contact that happens in crowded spaces. But there was no crowd here. There was only the Queen Consort, a senior officer, and the weight of centuries of protocol. Camilla stepped back involuntarily, her heel catching the edge of her chair. She stumbled, caught herself on the armrest, and for one frozen moment, and the two of them stared at each other, she with shock and a flash of indignation, he with dawning horror at what his body had just done. "I am so sorry, Your Majesty. I tripped. The table. I would never—" Harrington's words tumbled out in an uncharacteristic rush. His soldier's composure, earned through firefights and field exercises, had deserted him completely. Camilla straightened her jacket, her face a careful mask. But behind the mask, something else was happening. The contact, and however accidental, had triggered something deeper than protocol. It wasn't just surprise. It was the visceral memory of another time, another uniform, another man whose touch had not been accidental. The comparison was unfair to Harrington, completely unreasonable, but emotions do not consult reason. "You would never what, Colonel?" Her voice had cooled by several degrees. "Never barge into the Queen Consort's presence like a recruit on his first parade? Never make physical contact with a member of the royal family without invitation?" Harrington's face had gone from flushed to ashen. "Ma'am, I apologize most humbly. The table, it wasn't where I expected." "The table has stood in this room for 200 years, Colonel. It is not in the habit of moving unexpectedly." Camilla's hand went to her arm where he had touched her, rubbing it absently. The gesture was unconscious, but Harrington saw it and felt his stomach drop further. That this was not going to be a simple misunderstanding smoothed over with apologies. This was going to follow him. Outside the chamber, in the small antechamber where aides and equerries waited during royal audiences, the atmosphere was normally one of quiet vigilance. Senior Equerry Commander Timothy Shaw was reviewing the afternoon schedule on his tablet, while two palace staffers hovered near the refreshment table. Through the heavy doors, and they heard nothing. The chamber was designed for privacy. But the door to the corridor opened, and a palace protection officer leaned in. "Commander, there's an issue. The king is on his way. He was in the next room with the Canadian High Commissioner and someone briefed an aide about an incident." Shaw's head snapped up. "What incident?" "Apparently the colonel made some kind of contact with the Queen. Unintentional from what I hear, but she's—" "I'm not pleased." Shaw was already moving toward the chamber doors. This was his worst nightmare, a breach of protocol, however accidental, with the Queen consort and the king about to arrive without warning. Protocol existed precisely to prevent these situations, to create such rigid formality that nothing unexpected could occur. And now, the unexpected had occurred spectacularly. He cracked the door open and saw the tableau inside. Harrington standing at attention, on his face a study in controlled panic. Camilla seated now, her back ramrod straight, her teacup in hand but untouched. The atmosphere could have frozen the Thames. "Your Majesty," Shaw began, stepping inside, "I understand there has been an incident, Commander." Camilla's voice was calm now, but it was the dangerous calm of a winter sky before snow. "Colonel Harrington appears to have forgotten that physical contact with the Queen Consort is not part of the regimental greeting protocol." Before Shaw could respond, the main doors opened fully and King Charles III entered, his face a complex study of concern and barely contained anger. Someone had clearly briefed him, and briefed him badly. Behind him, two private secretaries hovered uncertainly. What's this I hear about an assault on the Queen?" Charles's voice carried the particular edge that staff had learned to recognize, the tone that preceded the famous bloody thing pen incidents, the frustrated gestures at overflowing inkwells, the moments when the king's notoriously short fuse met royal protocol. Harrington snapped to attention so sharply his heels clicked. "Your Majesty, I must protest, it was not assault. I tripped over a table that had been moved." My hand brushed Her Majesty's arm as I attempted to steady myself. Nothing more. Charles's gaze swept the room, taking in his wife's rigid posture, her hand still absently touching her arm, the displaced occasional table, the guardsman's ashen face. Then his eyes settled on the porcelain figurine that had been knocked askew. "You tripped." Charles's voice was flat. A lieutenant colonel in the Coldstream Guards, trained in every conceivable tactical situation. I tripped over a table that has occupied the same position since my grandmother's reign. Sir, I can only repeat my apologies and my assurance that it was entirely accidental. Camilla spoke then, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly. Charles, perhaps we should discuss this privately. But the king was already moving toward his throne, not the great throne of the House of Lords, but the smaller ceremonial chair positioned for audiences. He sat heavily, and the gesture transformed the room. What had been a confrontation between equals was now an audience between sovereign and subject. The weight of monarchy descended. "Colonel Harrington," Charles said, and his voice had changed too. Less personal anger, more the formal disappointment of a king addressing an officer who had failed in his duty. "You will explain to me exactly what occurred. Not what you intended, not what you meant to do. What occurred?" The room fell silent. Outside, London traffic hummed faintly. Inside, a guardsman's career hung in the balance, and a king sat in judgment over something that was, at its heart, entirely human. An awkward moment, a stumble, an accidental touch that had awakened ghosts no one in the room could see. Harrington drew a breath. He had faced enemy fire. He had led men into situations where death was a real possibility. He had never been more terrified than he was in this moment. "Your Majesty, may I speak freely?" he asked. Charles inclined his head slightly. "That would be advisable." Harrington took a half-step forward, then stopped himself. No sudden movements, not now. "Sir, I arrived for this audience having reviewed the floor plan from 3 months ago. In that plan, the table where Her Majesty's figurine rests was positioned against the wall approximately 2 feet from its current location. I entered, saw Her Majesty silhouetted against the windows, and began my approach. My first 3 steps were according to protocol. My 4th step encountered a table where I expected open floor." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "When I struck the table, my body's automatic response was to reach for stability. That is training, sir. When balance is compromised, the body reaches for the nearest solid object. In that split second, the nearest solid object was the wall behind Her Majesty. My hand was reaching for the wall. It encountered Her Majesty's arm on the way. There was no intent. There was no force. There was simple, unfortunate physics." Camilla's expression flickered. It was a reasonable explanation. It was even, she had to admit, plausible. But reason and plausibility did not erase the feeling of unexpected contact, the flash of something between surprise and fear. Charles studied Harrington for a long moment. Then he turned to his wife. "Camilla, what do you wish?" It was the right question. The king could order anything: dismissal, discipline, a formal inquiry. But the monarchy worked best when it worked humanely, and the humanity of this moment belonged to his wife. Camilla set down her teacup with careful precision. She looked at Harrington, really looked at him for the first time since the incident. She saw a man who had served his country, who had clearly been mortified by an accident, who stood now not as a colonel, but as a human being facing the possible destruction of everything he had worked for. She thought about the men who had not meant to touch her, back in those years before she was queen, before she was even Camilla Parker Bowles. She thought about how the line between accident and intention could blur in memory, how a hand that meant nothing could echo hands that meant everything. Was she punishing this man for someone else's sins? Was she allowing old ghosts to dictate present justice? "I wish," she said slowly, "to understand why the table was moved." Colonel Harrington reviewed a floor plan. He followed that plan. The table was not where the plan indicated. Who authorized the change? It was a masterful reframing. The question shifted focus from Harrington's actions to the system's failure that had caused them. Charles recognized the maneuver immediately and felt a surge of respect for his wife's political instincts. She was not backing down. She was expanding the inquiry. Shaw stepped forward. "Your Majesty." "And the table was moved 2 weeks ago by palace staff during cleaning. It was repositioned slightly to accommodate new electrical outlets for recording equipment. The change was not communicated to the protocol office." 2 weeks, Charles repeated. "And in 2 weeks, no one thought to inform visiting officers that the floor plan had changed? No one updated the briefing materials?" "Sir, it appears there was a breakdown in communication between palace operations and the ceremonial office. I take full responsibility." "You weren't even aware of the change until this moment, Commander. How can you take responsibility for something you didn't know existed?" Charles's voice had lost its edge now, shifting from anger to inquiry. The responsibility lies with whoever failed to update the records and communicate the change. Harrington stood motionless, watching his fate move from the personal to the institutional. He was no longer the focus. The focus was on palace operations, on systems and protocols and communication failures, but he knew enough about royal households to know that someone would pay. Systems failures required human sacrifices. Camilla rose from her chair and walked to the window. For a long moment, she looked out at the tourists gathered beyond the palace gates, the cameras and selfie sticks, the ordinary people for whom the monarchy was a fairy tale of glamour and protocol. They had no idea how fragile it all was, and how dependent on floor plans and briefing documents and people remembering to update records. "Colonel Harrington," she said without turning around, "you will remain with us for the remainder of the afternoon. There is a reception for regimental commanders at 4 o'clock. I expect you to attend." Harrington blinked. This was not dismissal. This was not discipline. This was inclusion? "Your Majesty, You will attend, and you will stand near me, and you will greet your fellow officers. And when anyone asks about the incident that they will surely have heard about by then, you will tell them exactly what you told us, that you tripped over a table that had been moved without proper notification, and that the Queen Consort was gracious enough to accept your apology and move on." She turned from the window, her face composed. "Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty. Understood." Charles watched his wife with something like wonder. In the space of 10 minutes, she had transformed a potential scandal into a lesson in leadership, an accident into an opportunity. She had protected a man's career while holding the institution accountable. She had done what monarchs were supposed to do, turned chaos into order. "Then we are agreed," Charles said, rising from his throne. "Commander Shaw, you will personally review the protocol for communicating floor plan changes. I want a report on my desk by Friday. Colonel Harrington, you will attend the reception. And Camilla." He crossed to his wife and took her hand. "You will allow me to escort you to lunch before the afternoon's obligations begin." Camilla smiled, a real smile, the first since Harrington had entered the room. "I would like that very much." As the King and Queen departed, Shaw approached Harrington. "Colonel, if I may offer some advice, at the reception do not mention the table, do not mention the incident, simply be present, be professional, and let Her Majesty set the tone. She has given you a gift. Do not examine its wrapping." Harrington nodded slowly. "Commander, what just happened in there? I came in expecting a routine audience. I left expecting to be cashiered. Now I'm attending a reception with the Queen Consort." Shaw allowed himself a small smile. "What happened, Colonel, is that you encountered the monarchy at its best. Not the pomp, not the ceremony, the humanity. The king could have destroyed you. The queen could have demanded it. Instead, they chose to build something. Remember that. Most people never see this side of them." The reception that afternoon proceeded without incident. Harrington stood near Camilla for 2 hours, accepting curious glances from fellow officers, responding to veiled questions with calm repetition of the facts. By the end, the story had settled into its proper form: an accident, an apology, forgiveness granted, lesson learned. And in the private chambers that evening, Charles poured his wife a glass of wine and raised it in a silent toast. She looked at him quizzically. "To you," he said simply. "To the way you handled today. To the queen you are becoming." Camilla sipped her wine. "I almost had him removed, you know. For one moment, I wanted him gone. It wasn't rational, it was just feeling." "But you didn't act on the feeling. That's the difference between impulse and judgment." She nodded slowly. I kept thinking about all the times in my life when I wasn't believed, when accidents were treated as intentions, when my version of events was dismissed. I didn't want to be that person, the one who uses power to punish rather than to understand. Charles set down his glass and took her hand. You are not that person. You never have been. Today proved it. Outside the palace windows, London darkened into evening. Tourists packed up their cameras and headed for hotels. And the guards changed at Buckingham Palace with their usual precision, every step measured, every movement choreographed. And in a small flat in Chelsea, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington sat in his armchair, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events, and marveling at his narrow escape. The table would be moved back to its original position the next morning. The floor plan would be updated, the protocols would be revised, and somewhere in the vast machinery of the royal household, and a lesson would be learned about the distance between intention and impact, and the grace required to bridge that distance when it matters most. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and the incident at St. James's Palace had receded into the category of palace lore, the kind of story whispered among junior staff but never discussed in polite company. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington had received his promotion to full colonel and a new posting that kept him safely away from royal audiences. And all was as it should be. But in the royal household, nothing ever truly disappeared. Memories lingered in filing cabinets and personnel records, in the subtle shifts of favor that determined careers. And on a gray March morning, Commander Shaw received a visitor who would reopen questions everyone thought had been settled. The visitor was Major Sarah Chen of the Coldstream Guards, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s with a reputation for meticulous attention to detail. She sat across from Shaw's desk with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to control her emotions completely. "Commander," she began, "I'm here about the incident last September, the one involving Colonel Harrington and the Queen." Shaw felt his internal alarms activate. "That matter was resolved, Major. The Queen accepted the Colonel's apology, and the King signed off on the protocol review. There's nothing further to discuss." "With respect, Commander." There is." Chen reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thin folder. "I've been conducting an internal review of regimental protocols, and I discovered something that wasn't included in the original investigation." She slid a photograph across the desk. It showed the audience chamber, taken from an angle that clearly included the occasional table with its porcelain figurine. In the corner of the photo, a date stamp was visible. It was dated 3 days before Harrington's audience. This photo was taken by a palace photographer during a routine documentation of the staterooms," Chen said. "You'll notice the table's position." Shaw studied the image. The table stood against the wall, exactly where Harrington had expected it to be. "Now look at this." Chen produced a second photograph, taken from the same angle but dated 2 weeks after the incident. The table was in its new position, the one that had caused Harrington to trip. "Major, we already established that the table was moved during cleaning and the change wasn't communicated. What's your point?" Chen's expression didn't change. "My point, Commander, is that I interviewed the cleaning staff who worked in that room during the relevant period. Every single one of them stated categorically that they never moved that table. It's heavy, you see, solid oak, custom-made for the room in 1820. It takes at least 2 strong staff to shift it even a few inches. The cleaning crew doesn't move it. They work around it." Shaw felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March temperature. "Then who moved it?" "That's what I'm here to determine." Chen leaned forward slightly. "Because if the cleaning staff didn't move it and the protocol office wasn't notified of any change, then someone moved that table deliberately, and someone ensured that the change wasn't documented, and that someone, Commander, set a trap." The word hung in the air between them. A trap. It transformed everything, an accident into intention, a stumble into conspiracy. "You're suggesting someone wanted Colonel Harrington to trip? Wanted him to make contact with the Queen?" "I'm suggesting that the table was moved by persons unknown, at some point between the photograph 3 days before the audience and the audience itself. I'm suggesting that the failure to update protocols was either gross negligence or deliberate sabotage. And I'm suggesting, Commander, and that we need to find out which before someone else gets hurt. Shaw sat back in his chair, his mind racing. If Chen was right, then the incident that had nearly destroyed Harrington's career wasn't an accident. It was a setup. And if it was a setup, then someone in the palace had wanted exactly what happened. A breach of protocol, royal anger, a guardsman's humiliation. The question was why. Who benefits? He asked aloud. Chen shook her head. That's the part I can't figure out. Harrington's a solid officer, well-liked, no enemies I know of. He wasn't up for any controversial promotions. He wasn't involved in palace politics. He was just a guy doing his job. Then maybe it wasn't about Harrington. Shaw stood and walked to his window, looking out at the palace courtyard where guards changed with mechanical precision. Maybe it was about the Queen or the King. Someone wanted an incident. Someone wanted tension between the royals and the military. Someone wanted exactly what they got. Until the Queen handled it gracefully and turned it into nothing. Exactly. Shaw turned back to face her. Whoever planned this didn't count on Camilla's response. They expected anger, punishment, a scandal. Instead, they got forgiveness and a protocol review. Their plan backfired. Chen nodded slowly. So they might try again. A different target, a different method, but the same goal. Create conflict, embarrass the royals, or drive a wedge somewhere. The implications were staggering. Somewhere in the palace's 1,000 rooms, in its labyrinth of corridors and hierarchies, someone was working against the crown. Not openly, that would be too easy to detect, but subtly, carefully, placing obstacles and moving furniture and waiting for accidents to happen. We need to tell the king, Shaw said. Can we? Without proof? Without knowing who? Shaw considered. The king's temper was well documented. If Charles learned that someone had deliberately endangered his wife, the reaction would be explosive.